Hi, it's Phil here from Revive My Ride. If you're watching this video, then the chances are that you've got old rusty dust shields and they've probably started rubbing on your brakes, so you need to know how to swap them out for new ones. Well, good news, so in this video, using a step-by-step approach, I'm going to show you all the tools, everything you need to know to be able to do this job yourself at home. If you like the content, then please give me a thumbs up, and please consider subscribing to avoid missing out on future videos. Okay, let's get to it. Okay, so the first thing you need to do is jack up the car and get it onto the axle stands and then remove the wheel. I've actually done a really good video on this, so if you want to know how to do this, then please follow the link which should appear on the top right hand side of the screen right about now, and that'll tell you everything you need to know, and then I'll just continue from here. Now that we've got the wheel off, it's possible to inspect the dust shields. So when your car's about 10 years or so old, then these dust shields get rusty, and sometimes they start to press against the disc, and you can hear the noise from this inside the cabin of the car. But on the other side you can actually see the source of the problems. So this bent dust shield was pressing against the disc, and I could really hear the scraping noise from it. In order to remove the old dust shield, we have to get to the bolts that hold it in place. To do this, we need to remove the brakes. So we're going to start with the brake caliper first. So the first thing to do is turn your steering, and this will give access to the bolts that hold the caliper in place. On this particular brake caliper, there's two bolts, one at the top and one at the bottom, and the caliper will come off in one piece. Here's a different view of it so that you can see where the two bolts are. Okay, so I'm just going to apply a little bit of WD-40 to these bolts, and I'll go and do it on the other side as well, so that then they can be soaking, and that will make the bolts come out more easily. So now, using a breaker bar and the correct size socket, we just need to break loose those bolts. Now, because we turned the steering, this means we can get this bar in more easily. So once they're loosened off, I'm going to swap to the ratchet, because it's a little bit easier to use in this confined space. So quite a bit of ratcheting because they're quite long bolts, but eventually we'll get them removed. And as you remove the second one, just be aware that the caliper may move or slip down, so you have to be ready to catch it. So if you gently lever the inside pad back a little bit, then it gives the clearance you need to get the caliper off of the disc. What this actually does is pushes the piston back slightly. So once you've done that, the caliper should come loose and you'll be able to remove it off of the disc. Here I've got some tie wraps on standby, and I use these to hold the caliper up against the spring, and that holds it safe out of the way. You have to be careful here, because if you let the caliper drop, then it can damage the brake hose, or actually it can damage the electrical cable that comes to the brake pad wear indicator. There's a little securing screw that holds the disc in place, and it requires a T30 bit to remove it. So I use this little T30 bit with a special adapter that holds it onto my quarter drive socket set. And so that disc will just come off now. Okay, now it's time to remove the hub nut cover. The cover is just pressed into place, so it's really easy to remove just by tapping with a screwdriver. So tap in one position and then rotate the hub and tap again, and gradually work it loose, making sure you don't cockle it, otherwise it will jam in place. Here I'm marking the end of the shaft and the nut using a center punch. This is because we're going to remove this nut in a second, and when I refit it again I want it to go back to the exact same position. This is really important because we want to make sure we have the correct tension on the wheel bearing. Okay, now we're ready to remove the hub nut. So you do this by loosening off this Allen key bolt, which effectively locks it in place. It's a 6mm Allen key, and I'm using this little piece of pipe here to get extra leverage. So you just need to crack it loose and undo it a couple of turns, and then that actually frees up the hub nut, and you'll be able to just spin the hub nut off now by hand. Now as you start to remove the hub, the outer part of the bearing is loose, so just be careful it doesn't drop out on the floor. So remove the bearing carefully and put it somewhere nice and clean and safe. And now the hub itself actually just slides off, so you can just quite easily grab the back edges of it and pull it free. Okay, we're finally ready to remove our old rusty dust covers. And you can see the bolts here. So because they're old and rusty, I'm going to give them all a squirt of WD-40 and let that soak for a couple of minutes. Much more chance of the bolts coming off in one piece and not stripping them. So now using the Torx socket, you can give them a little tap, and what this effectively does is free them off a little bit and make them easier to remove. So giving ourselves the best possible chance of these bolts coming off in one piece. Once we've done that, we can get the ratchet on, and you should be able to just loosen off these bolts. I didn't have a particular problem with mine, so hopefully yours will be similar. So just break them free with the ratchet, and then using the socket and extension just spin them out. You'll note that there is a little bit of blue Loctite on these bolts, so that's to make sure that they stay tight and stay in place. So when we're refitting again, we'll need to clean that off and apply some new. With all three bolts removed, then the dust cover should just come free, so you can just slide it up over the edge of the shaft. One thing that will probably happen though is that the foam that's on the back of the dust cover will probably just come off on the hub here, which you can see. And it's just a little piece that protects the sensor. So it's important that this gets removed and then it all gets cleaned up. So here you can see I'm just spraying everything down really well with brake cleaner. And then I'm cleaning up the mounting points for where the new dust cover is going to go on. And I'm also cleaning the shaft here, just to make sure that there's no dirt on it, cleaning the sensor, etc. In preparation for fitting the new dust cover, we have to get the bolts ready to go again. So what I normally do is I'll wire brush them all to clean off all the old blue Loctite, and then give them all a spray of brake cleaner as well and give them a wipe down. So this means that the bolt's nice and clean and ready for new Loctite to be applied. So here's the new dust cover ready to be fitted. And this is the foam part that protects the sensor that we talked about earlier. So it comes with a new one already on there. So refitting's pretty simple, so we just slide the new one up in place, exactly as we remove the old one. Apply a little bit of Loctite to the bolts, and then using our Torx socket and extension, screw them back in place again. So usually I'll put them in just hand tight, the first one, and then I'll go ahead and get the other ones in place before going around and then tightening them all up again. To do the final tightening, here I've got a small mini torque wrench, and I've set it to 10 Newton meters. So I'm just going to put a torque socket onto the torque wrench, and then just do this final tightening for each three of the bolts. Now we're ready to fit the hub again. So here I've got some high temperature general purpose grease, and I'm just applying a little bit to the shaft here because we cleaned it earlier, which means we removed some of the grease. So to make sure we have the right amount, I'm adding a little bit more. So now the hub will just slide back into place again. Here's the bearing from earlier, which we've been keeping clean. So again, that just pushes into place. And now we've got the nut. So we can go ahead and spin the nut back into position. And then if necessary, you can use a spanner or a wrench just to get that final adjustment. But what you're doing is you're lining up the marks that you made earlier. So just a little double check to make sure the marks line up. And if they do, then the tension on the wheel bearing should be correct. So get your 6mm Allen key and retighten up that cap head bolt. So again, I'm just using the bar just to give an extra little bit of leverage to tighten the bolt up. Here I'm just applying a little bit of copper grease to the hub, and this is in preparation for fitting the brake disc in a little while. In the meantime, we've got the hub nut cover to put back in place. And this just pops into place and it's a push fit. So just using a rubber mallet, you can tap it back into place. This is better than using a metal hammer because you don't want to damage the hub nut cover. Similar to removal, you want it to go on evenly. So you can just turn the hub and check to make sure it's gone in nice and even. Okay, so now it's time to prepare the brake disc for refitting. So I'm just scraping the back of the brake disc with a scraper and then emptying out the bits. And then I have some emery cloth as well, so just using that to sand down any high bits. And this is just to make the brake disc go back on nice and square and even. Once you've done this, give it a little blast down with brake cleaner and a wipe out to get it as clean as possible. Okay, so with the brake disc prepared, we can pop that back into place. And then we've got the securing screw here. So similar to earlier on with the dust cover bolts, we just want to give those a quick clean up. Reapply some blue Loctite and then screw it back into place. So I'm just screwing this in by hand first, and now I've got the mini torque wrench again, and I'm giving that a final tighten up with the torque wrench. I used 10 Newton meters, the same as earlier. In preparation for refitting the brake caliper, I'm just getting the bolts ready to go. So similar to earlier, I'm giving them a good blast with the brake cleaner and a wipe down. And now you can see I'm applying some fresh blue Loctite to the threads on both of the bolts and just smoothing it down into the threads ready to go. Okay, so with the bolts prepared, we can clip the tie wrap that's holding the brake caliper up in place, and we can push the caliper back into position again. It should just slide back in over the brake disc. So starting with the top bolt, I'm just going to screw it into place by hand, so just finger tight at this point. And now fitting the bottom bolt too, and again just screwing it in finger tight. And I'm just using the ratchet to put the bolt in fully. But the final torquing I'm going to do with a torque wrench. So here's the torque wrench, and I'm setting it to 115 Newton meters and locking it off. So using the 18mm socket, I'm going to do the final torquing, starting with the top bolt until it clicks. And then moving on and tightening up the second bolt. In preparation for refitting the wheels, I'm putting a little bit of copper slip onto the brake disc here, just a thin layer. And this will make the wheel come off easier if you have to change it at the side of the road. So go ahead and lift the wheel up into place, making sure that you line up where the wheel bolt needs to go through into the brake disc. And now you're ready to go ahead and put the wheel bolts in. So using a 17mm socket in the extension, I start by just winding these in by hand until they're finger tight. And I put all 5 bolts in this way. Remember that one of the bolts is likely to have a locking key. So make sure you have the locking key on hand, and then you can go ahead and put that one in too. So now I'm swapping to the ratchet, and the reason is I just want to have this wheel nipped up a little bit because in a minute I'm going to drop it down off the axle stands, and I want to make sure that the wheel bolts are at least a little bit tightened before I do that. The final torquing of the wheel nuts is done when the car's been dropped back down onto the ground again. So as I mentioned earlier, it's 120 newtons, so I'm setting the torque wrench here. And then just with a short extension in the socket, I'm going around each of the 5 wheel nuts and I'm just doing the final tightening until the torque wrench clicks. Just a final important point, once you've finished with all of your torque wrenches, make sure you wind them back down to 0, because if you leave them and put them away tensioned up, then they lose their calibration. Thank you for watching. I hope you found the video useful. If you liked the video, please give me a thumbs up. It's great for motivation and I really appreciate the feedback. All tools and parts are in the description with links below. Comments and questions are always welcome, so please send them in. See you next time on Revive My Ride.